On my wedding day, my cruel stepmom ordered me to clean her dirty toilet. When I refused and said, "I'm not your servant," she became furious and shouted, "How dare you talk back to me?" In her anger, she grabbed a hockey stick and struck me on the head. I was badly injured and cried out for help. My fiancé heard my screams and rushed me to the hospital, saving my life. The very next day, I returned with a shocking revenge that no one expected. My name is Flora Andrews, and this is the story of how I rose above betrayal, abuse, and manipulation to reclaim my life. If someone had told me years ago that my life would take such an unexpected turn, I wouldn't have believed them. But life has a way of throwing the most unimaginable challenges at us, doesn't it? Let me start from the beginning. I was only 9 when my mother passed away. She was my rock, my light, and the warm presence that made our house feel like a home. After her death, everything changed. My father, Richard, remarried just a year later. His new wife, Victoria, was nothing like my mother. Where my mother had been kind and nurturing, Victoria was cold, calculating, and sharp-tongued. From the very first day she moved in, she treated me not as her stepdaughter, but as her servant. At first, I thought she just needed time to adjust, but as the days turned into months, and then years, her disdain for me only grew. I became the target of her bitterness and jealousy. "Why are you just sitting there? Do the dishes." She'd snap at me even if I had homework to complete. "What good are your books going to do you? A girl like you should know her place." Her resentment only intensified as I excelled in school. I was determined to honor my mother's memory by doing well in my studies, but every award I brought home felt like a spark to the fire of her hatred. "You think you're better than everyone else because you have a degree," she sneered when I graduated from college with honors. "Let's see where all your education gets you when you're married and chained to a kitchen." The most painful part of it all was my father's silence. I remember how he used to be before Victoria came into our lives. Strong, protective, and loving. But under her manipulative influence, he changed. It was as if she had him under a spell. He stopped defending me and became a passive observer to her cruelty. I still remember one day when I was 16, and Victoria accused me of stealing money from her purse. Money I never even saw. I begged my father to believe me, but he just stood there, silent, as Victoria screamed at me and grounded me for weeks. That was the day I realized I was on my own. But I didn't give up. I poured all my energy into my studies, knowing that education was my way out of this prison. By the time I turned 24, I had a stable job as a software engineer in New York City, and I was engaged to the most wonderful man, Daniel Carter. Daniel was everything Victoria wasn't: kind, supportive, and fiercely protective of me. He was a lawyer, and he had a natural sense of justice that made me feel safe for the first time in years. I often wondered what he saw in me, but he always said it was my strength and resilience that drew him in. Still, even with Daniel in my life, I couldn't fully escape Victoria's grip. She had a way of reminding me that no matter how successful I became, I was still under her control. As long as I lived in that house, yes, even with a stable job, I had been saving up to move out after my wedding. Victoria couldn't stand the idea of me being happy. She would nitpick every detail of my wedding plans, pretending to help but always finding ways to make me feel small. "That dress looks cheap," she'd say, or "Are you sure Daniel will even show up? Men like him don't stay with women like you." But despite her constant jabs, I held my head high. I was about to start a new chapter in my life, and for once, I felt hopeful. Then came the morning of my wedding day, the day everything changed. I woke up feeling nervous but excited. I got ready carefully, slipping into my dress and fixing my hair and makeup. As I stood in front of the mirror, I felt the surge of pride. For the first time, I looked and felt like the strong, confident woman I had worked so hard to become. But Victoria couldn't let me have that moment. She barged into my room, her face twisted with anger. "What are you doing? Just standing there," she barked. "The bathroom needs cleaning. Get to it." I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? It's my wedding day." "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "You think you're above doing chores just because you're wearing a fancy dress? Get in there and clean it now." "No," I said firmly for the first time. I stood my ground. "I am not your servant, and I never will be again. From today onward, you will do your own dirty work." Her eyes blazed with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screamed. Before I could react, she grabbed a hockey stick from the corner of the room and swung it at me. The pain was immediate and blinding. I fell to the floor, clutching my arm as blood pooled around me. I screamed for help, but my father just stood there frozen, as if he couldn't decide whose side to take. It was Daniel who saved me. Hearing my cries, he burst through the door, took one look at me on the floor, and rushed to my side. "Flora," he cried, lifting me into his arms. "What happened? Who did this to you?" I could barely speak through the pain, but I managed to whisper, "Victoria." His face darkened with anger. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice firm. "I'm taking you to the hospital, and then we're going to make sure she pays for this." As he carried me out of the house, I caught one last glimpse of Victoria. She stood there, her face pale but defiant, as if she still believed she could get away with it. Little did she know, her reign of terror was about to end. As Daniel carried me out of that house, I felt a mix of emotions: pain, anger, and an overwhelming sense of relief. For years I had endured Victoria's cruelty, my father's silent complicity, but that day I knew things were finally going to change. At the hospital, doctors quickly tended to my injuries. The hockey stick had left a deep gash on my arm, and I had bruises forming on my ribs from where I had hit the floor. As I lay on the hospital bed, a nurse cleaned my wounds, and Daniel stayed by my side, holding my hand. "Flora," he said gently, "I need you to tell me everything. Don't hold anything back. What she did to you today is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?" I hesitated, feeling a lump in my throat. For years I had buried the pain, convincing myself that it was normal or that I could handle it. But now, with Daniel looking at me with such concern and determination, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. "She's been like this for years," I began, my voice trembling. "Ever since she married my father, she treats me like a servant, always demeaning me, always finding ways to make me feel small. And my father," I paused, swallowing hard, "he just lets her. He doesn't defend me. He never has." Daniel's jaw tightened, and I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. "This ends now," he said firmly. "I promise you, Flora, she will pay for this. Both of them will." The next few days were a whirlwind. Daniel, being the meticulous lawyer that he was, wasted no time in gathering evidence. He insisted on documenting everything: my medical reports, photos of my injuries, even statements from the hospital staff who had treated me. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue legal action. The idea of standing up to Victoria and my father felt overwhelming. But Daniel wouldn't let me back down. "You've been through enough," he said. "This isn't just about punishing them. It's about taking back control of your life. You deserve justice, Flora." His words struck a chord with me. He was right. I had spent too long living in fear, too long letting Victoria dictate my life. It was time to stand up for myself. With Daniel's guidance, we filed charges against Victoria for assault and against my father for neglect. The process was daunting, but Daniel was with me every step of the way. "I'll handle the legal side," he'd assured me. "All you have to do is tell your truth." The first time we went to the police station to file a complaint, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. Victoria's voice echoed in my mind, mocking me, telling me I was weak. But as I looked at Daniel standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, I found the courage to speak up. The officers listened as I recounted what had happened on my wedding day and the years of abuse leading up to it. I saw their expressions change as I described Victoria's manipulative ways and my father's silence. "This isn't just about one incident," I told them. "This is about a lifetime of cruelty and neglect." The officers took my statement seriously, and within days, Victoria and my father were both served legal notices. Victoria, predictably, tried to deny everything. She spun her usual web of lies, painting herself as the victim and me as an ungrateful stepdaughter. "She's lying," she shrieked during one of the hearings. "She's just trying to ruin my life because she's jealous of me," but her lies didn't hold up against the mountain of evidence Daniel had collected. He had even tracked down a few former household staff who were willing to testify about the way Victoria had treated me over the years. As the case progressed, my father remained eerily silent. I couldn't tell if he was ashamed or if he still believed Victoria's lies. Either way, his lack of support hurt more than I wanted to admit. "Do you think he'll ever take responsibility?" I asked Daniel one evening as we reviewed the case files. Daniel sighed. "I don't know, Flora, but whether he does or not, this isn't about him. This is about you. Focus on that." Those words stayed with me. For so long, I had yearned for my father's approval, for him to stand up for me, but now I realized I didn't need it. What I needed was to stand up for myself. The courtroom became my battlefield. Daniel was relentless, dismantling Victoria's lies piece by piece. When she claimed I had attacked her first, he presented my medical reports, which clearly showed the severity of my injuries. When she tried to portray herself as a loving stepmother, he brought in witnesses who testified otherwise. Each day in court was exhausting, but it was also empowering. For the first time, I felt like I had a voice, like I wasn't just a victim anymore. Victoria's confidence began to crumble as the evidence against her piled up. Even my father, who had initially tried to downplay his role, couldn't escape the truth. His silence in the face of Victoria's abuse was just as damning as her actions. By the time the trial was nearing its end, I could see the fear in their eyes. They had spent years controlling me, but now the tables had turned. The courtroom was a place I had never imagined myself being. For years I had learned to endure and suppress my pain, but now I was being asked to expose it all, to lay my scars bare for the world to see. Every time I stepped inside, I felt the weight of my past pressing down on me, but I reminded myself that this was about more than just me. This was about reclaiming my life and holding Victoria and my father accountable for everything they had done. Daniel was a force to be reckoned with in court. I had always admired his confidence and sharp mind, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. He was methodical, leaving no stone unturned, no detail overlooked. He approached the case with the same determination that had kept me going through all those years of torment. The first time I was called to the stand, I felt my throat tighten with nerves. The courtroom was packed, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. My father sat next to her, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he couldn't bear to look at me. "Flora," Daniel began, his voice calm and reassuring, "can you tell the court about the events that took place on the morning of your wedding day?" I took a deep breath and began. I was in my room getting ready for the ceremony. I said, I had just finished putting on my dress when Victoria barged in. She told me to clean the bathroom, and when I refused, she hit me with a hockey stick. There was a murmur in the courtroom, and I felt my cheeks flush. It was one thing to tell Daniel what had happened, but it was another to say it in front of so many strangers. But I pressed on, recounting every detail of that day and the years of abuse that had led up to it. She's always treated me like a servant, I said, my voice steady as I spoke. She would insult me, belittle me, and make me do all the household chores. And my father, I paused, glancing at him. He never stopped her. He just stood by and let it happen. Victoria's attorney tried to discredit me, of course. They painted me as a spoiled, ungrateful stepdaughter who was trying to ruin an innocent woman's reputation. But Daniel was ready for them. He presented the medical reports that documented my injuries, photos of the bruises Victoria had left on me, and testimony from the hospital staff who had treated me. One of the most powerful moments came when Daniel called a former housekeeper to the stand. She had worked for us for several years before quitting, and her testimony was damning. Victoria was always harsh with Flora, the housekeeper said. She would yell at her, insult her, and make her do all the work around the house. I even saw her slap Flora once when she didn't move fast enough. I quit because I couldn't stand to watch it anymore. Victoria's mask of confidence began to crack after that. She interrupted the proceedings several times, shouting accusations and denials, but each outburst only made her look more guilty. Her lawyer struggled to rein her in, and I could see the frustration on his face. My father's testimony was equally heartbreaking and infuriating. When he was called to the stand, he admitted that he had seen Victoria's behavior, but claimed he had been powerless to stop her. I didn't know what to do, he said, his voice trembling. Victoria, she's strong-willed. I thought it was just her way of parenting. Parenting? Daniel's voice was sharp. Do you consider ignoring years of abuse to be a form of parenting, Mr. Andrews? My father didn't answer. He looked down, his silence speaking volumes. For years I had craved his support, his validation. But sitting there, watching him struggle to justify his inaction, I realized I didn't need it anymore. He had failed me, and no excuse could change that. The trial stretched on for weeks. Each day was a battle, but with each piece of evidence presented, I felt stronger. Daniel called expert witnesses, including psychologists who explained the long-term effects of abuse, and forensic specialists who validated the authenticity of the medical reports. Victoria's defense crumbled bit by bit. Her attempts to manipulate the narrative and paint herself as the victim were no match for the truth. By the time closing arguments were made, I could see the weariness in her eyes. She knew she had lost. But the hardest part was waiting for the verdict. It took the jury 2 days to deliberate, and those 48 hours felt like an eternity. Daniel stayed with me the entire time, reassuring me and reminding me that we had done everything we could. Finally, the day came. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The foreman stood and began to read the verdict. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Victoria Andrews, guilty. My eyes filled with tears as I heard the words. Victoria's face turned pale, her defiance replaced with disbelief. The court also found my father complicit in neglect, holding him accountable for his role in enabling the abuse. For the first time in years, I felt the sense of justice, but the story wasn't over yet. The moment the verdict was read, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, relief, validation, and a bittersweet sense of victory. After years of suffering and silence, I had finally stood up for myself, and the truth had prevailed. Victoria was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face pale and her arrogance gone. My father, too, sat slumped in his seat, his once confident demeanor replaced with shame and regret. The sentencing came a few weeks later. Victoria received a prison sentence for assault, while my father faced severe financial penalties and was ordered to attend counseling for enabling her abuse. Watching them face the consequences of their actions was cathartic, but it didn't erase the scars they had left on me. Still, it marked the end of a dark chapter in my life and the beginning of something new. The media caught wind of the case, and it became a headline story. Reporters called it the betrayal trial, and while I didn't enjoy the attention, I knew it was important for people to see what justice could look like. I even received messages from strangers, people who had been through similar situations, thanking me for sharing my story. One day, a journalist asked me, "How do you feel now that it's over?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. It's not about how I feel. It's about showing others that they don't have to stay silent. Abuse thrives in silence, and speaking up is the first step toward ending it. But the story didn't end with the verdict. There was one final twist that no one, not even Daniel, had anticipated. During the investigation into Victoria's finances, it was discovered that she had been secretly funneling my father's wealth into offshore accounts for years. She had drained his assets, leaving him virtually bankrupt. When this was revealed, my father looked stunned. He had spent years blindly supporting Victoria, turning a blind eye to her abuse and giving her control over their finances. Now he was left with nothing. I wish I could say I felt sympathy for him, but I didn't. His silence had cost me so much, and now it had cost him everything. I hoped this would be a wake-up call for him, a chance to reflect on his choices. As for me, life began to move forward. Daniel and I finally had the wedding we had postponed. It was a small, intimate ceremony, nothing like the grand affair we had originally planned, but it was perfect. As I walked down the aisle, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Daniel looked at me with so much love and pride that it brought tears to my eyes. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered as we exchanged vows. "I'm so proud of you." With Daniel by my side, I began to rebuild my life. We moved into a cozy apartment in the city, far away from a house that had been the source of so much pain. I continued my work as a software engineer, but I also found a new purpose. Inspired by my journey, I started volunteering at a local organization that helps survivors of abuse. Sharing my story with others, hearing theirs in return, and working to provide resources for those in need gave me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't expected. One day, during a support group meeting, a young woman approached me. "I read about your case in the news," she said, her voice trembling. "It gave me the courage to leave my abusive relationship. Thank you." Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to inspire change, to turn pain into something meaningful. As for Victoria, I heard that she struggled to adjust to life in prison. The woman who had once ruled over our household with an iron fist was now powerless, forced to confront the consequences of her actions. And my father, I don't know if he ever truly came to terms with what he had done or failed to do. He tried to reach out to me once, sending a letter asking for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Forgiveness might come one day, but not yet. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything that has happened, I realize how far I've come. I'm no longer the scared, submissive girl who lived in fear of her stepmother. I'm stronger now, more confident, and more determined than ever to live a life free from the shadows of my past. Daniel often tells me how proud he is of me, but the truth is, I'm proud of myself too. I stood up for what was right, and I reclaimed my life. My story isn't just about betrayal and revenge. It's about resilience, justice, and the power of speaking up. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we are stronger than we think, and no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way to find the light. My name is Flora Andrews, and this is my story.